Hey, it's Chris Fleming. Welcome back to July's edition of Spirit Talk. Now, our guest this month is an internationally recognized scholar in international politics, conflict resolution, and U.S. foreign policy. He's also lectured at universities in the USA and Australia. Now, he wrote the first published book on exopolitics in 2004 and followed this with another examining exopolitics and U.S. foreign policy in 2009. He authored Galactic Diplomacy in 2013, and this was followed by Kennedy's Last Stand, which investigated the relationship between classified UFOs and the Kennedy assassination. In 2015, he authored Insiders Reveal Secret Space Programs and Extraterrestrial Alliances. His most recent published book is The U.S. Navy's Secret Space Program and Nordic Extraterrestrial Alliance. Please welcome our guest this month, Dr. Michael Salla. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for being on the show.
Aloha, Chris. Thanks for inviting me.
I am really intrigued about this book that you just published, as well as some of the things you've done in the past. We get into some controversies. We get into secret government information, as well as different alliances that exist with alien beings that's been discussed over many years and even some of the cultures. But first, so my listeners get a little idea about yourself and what you speak about and write about, is what is exopolitics?
Well, the simplest way of understanding exopolitics is to just see it as a subfield within the genre of politics. So, for example, I have a degree in political science, actually a PhD, and I taught in various schools of government or political science. And so within that, you have subfields, like you'll have comparative politics, you'll have international politics, you'll have political economy. And so exopolitics is just a subfield of the political arena, but in say, for example, international politics, you're looking at, what's happening around the planet. With exopolitics, you're looking at what's happening at a kind of galactic level or at an interplanetary level. So though that's kind of probably the easiest way of understanding what this field of exopolitics is all about.
Well, that's really intriguing. And now, your new book that just came out, USA Navy's Secret Space Program, and the Nordics, which I'm very familiar with, the Nordics, the Extraterrestrial Alliance. What is this book about? I mean, the title kind of gives it away, but people that don't know much about this, what could they expect from this book?
Well, what I do in the book is really look at all of the evidence that beginning in the early 1940s, the US Navy actually began doing work on trying to understand what it is that propels some of these UFOs that were being observed at the time. In 1942, for example, over Los Angeles, there was a famous incident, the Los Angeles air raid, which was widely reported. And essentially what we know from some leaked documents is that two of those UFO craft, which just hovered over the sky at the time, helicopters were just being developed, so there were none that were really kind of operational. So these UFOs just hovered over Los Angeles for several hours with kind of, over 1,000 artillery shells being fired at these things. So it was a kind of major event at that time. And two of these things were basically recovered by the Army, Air Force, and the Navy at the time. And so these were secretly being studied by the U.S. Navy at its classified facilities. At the time, the most advanced Navy projects. They would study them at China Lake. That was basically set up at the time to study these kinds of advanced technology projects well away from the public arena. And also the Navy had a espionage team embedded in Nazi Germany during the Second World War, where they were getting intelligence on what the Nazis were doing in terms of these flying saucer craft. And at the time, the Navy officials involved in this were kind of like in disbelief as to what they were being told by these Navy spies. But, as time wore on, the spies' intelligence got better and better. And the Navy personnel realized just how far the Germans had gone ahead in developing these kinds of flying saucer technologies, and they had a couple of their own from the Los Angeles air raid that they were studying.
So the Nazis actually recovered some UFOs as well, and they were trying to back engineer them?
Well, it goes even further back than that. Basically, what happened was that in the 1920s, the Nazis, well, this is even before the Nazis, this is during the time of the Weimar Republic, and Germany at the time, Germany was the defeated power from the First World War, and so German scientists and German military were kind of like, under this, tight scrutiny of the Versailles treatment the Versailles Treaty in terms of what they could develop. For example, the German Navy weren't allowed to have submarines. There were strict guidelines on the German Air Force, and so the Germans were kind of looking at innovative ways of kind of getting around the Versailles Treaty and all the strictures on it, and so they were very interested in these kind of like really exotic propulsion systems that were being proposed by German secret societies and innovative programs within German universities. And so this is how the German secret space program began, because the Germans at that time were really doing some amazing things. And you had these psychics, these teams of psychic women that said that they were in communication with extraterrestrials, and some of the designs of the early designs for building a flying saucer came from these psychic women that said, that they were in touch with these extraterrestrial civilizations. So it's like the movie Contact or the book Contact that Carl Sagan had put together, but rather than these instructions for building flying saucers being received through radio communications, as depicted in the book and in the film, for Germany in the 1920s, it was these psychic women that were coming forward and saying, we got these instructions for building a flying saucer. And so because the German Navy was working very closely with one of these, with several of these secret societies, in particular the Thule Society, that the German Navy kind of like got behind this. And they thought, well, let's see how feasible this all is. And as they developed it, it all turned out to be, some of these technologies were very feasible. That they actually built the first flying saucer prototypes in the early 1930s. That these became functional, and then in 1933, Hitler's Nazi regime, came to power, and they basically co-opted everything that the German Navy had been doing with these German secret societies.
That's incredible.
Well, this was the thing, that the Navy spies that were bringing back all of this intelligence, because they were embedded within the top aerospace facilities in Germany, and they were bringing back all of this history of how the Germans developed these flying saucer technologies, beginning with the Thule Society and the Vril Society, and that their initial flying saucer prototypes were called Vril. And they came up with the Navy spies that were embedded in Nazi Germany, right up until the beginning of America's involvement in the Second World War. But earlier than that, the Navy had spies embedded in there. They eventually learned that the Germans had developed 30 different prototypes, 30 different types of flying saucer craft, using different designs, different propulsion systems. Some of these propulsion systems use turbojets. Some use kind of like anti-gravity technologies with high voltage electrostatics. Others use torsion field physics. And so the Germans were experimenting with all these different propulsion systems to see which ones were the most feasible. And they actually were able to get their hands on some fully functional flying saucer craft themselves, just as the US, from the Los Angeles air raid got a couple. So the Germans also were able to get their hands on a few themselves, and this was what they began to reverse engineer in their aerospace programs. And this was something that the Navy spies were kind of reporting. And at the beginning, Chris, the senior people in the Navy espionage program were really in disbelief that this could be happening. But because, they had like 30 different spies embedded throughout German aerospace industries reporting on kind of very similar designs and different extraterrestrials that were involved in this. Eventually, the senior Navy officials, and we're going to kind of the level of the Undersecretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, who became the Secretary of the Navy in 1944. He was running this espionage program that was based out of Naval Air Station, San Diego. A Rear Admiral was put in charge of this program. And as the war progressed, they realized just how far the Nazis had gone in basically designing these flying saucer craft. And at the very end, Hitler's wonder weapons, I mean, there was really kind of like almost like a hair's breadth from these things going operational.
Wow. It's just amazing because obviously with the research you've done here and the stuff, and I've heard things about this going back into the 90s with the Nazis being involved with back engineering UFOs and almost having one fully developed, or they did, and thank God they weren't able to replicate them during World War II, is how this is all kept from the public, that all this technology, all this knowledge and advancement is not being utilized in normal society, in our own culture, that this is being used just basically in war or for their secret programs.
Well, that's exactly right, Chris. This information really is life-changing. I mean, the kinds of transportation we use today for just getting around on a day-to-day basis, I mean, that would be revolutionized if we had these kinds of technologies released, but they're all kept in these highly classified programs that deploy in deep space and also have underground facilities where they use these technologies, and Antarctica as well. I mean, this is Antarctica actually is a huge continent. It's 1.5 times the combined the 48 U.S. states and Alaska, and Antarctica is still 50% bigger than all of that combined. So, we're talking about a vast continent, and the Germans began deploying these technologies down there during the Second World War, especially as it became clear that they were going to lose the war, or that there was a real risk that the war wasn't going to succeed. In 42, 43, for example, they began to move a lot of equipment, a lot of resources down there because they used their submarines to be able to find these underwater passageways into the interior of Antarctica. And so they were able to define these huge caverns down there in Antarctica and basically build these out as bases. And you actually have the commander of the German Navy, Admiral Donitz, actually bragging about this no less than 3 times, saying that the German Navy had established an impenetrable fortress in a distant location. And during the Nuremberg war trials, he basically all but said that it was Antarctica. He said that it was located in an icy terrain. But by that time, by the Nuremberg trials, the Americans and the Russians and the British were putting a lid on this because they were actually had arranged for the mass media to put out the myth that Nazi Germany had been defeated, Hitler was dead, and that the war was a great success. In fact, the war had not ended. Hitler had escaped. There was a very powerful German breakaway group in Antarctica, and the best technologies that the Germans had developed had been relocated to Antarctica, so that by 1946, 1947, by the time the US Navy was ready to take on the Germans in Antarctica, it was too late. The German space program had been allowed to progress without any interference in Antarctica, so that when the Navy sent a task force down there, it was easily defeated by the German breakaway civilization in Antarctica. And it has continued to evolve and develop better, more powerful technologies, and has deployed in deep space. And the US Navy in particular has been playing catch up. The Air Force is well behind the Navy, and the Navy is well behind what the Germans did down in Antarctica.
I've heard rumors. They said that using some of the U-boats and everything, that Hitler fled to Antarctica and they had a secret base. And I remember seeing a photograph, and I don't know if it's an actual photograph or not, showing some mysterious round type base that is in Antarctica. And then there's people that believe that the Earth actually is flat because nobody can get past Antarctica. So it's like it causes other conspiracies and other belief systems. The question is, with the type of technology America has and Russia and everything, do we have now an alliance with them, or do we let them do what they're doing, or are we still trying to get in there to Antarctica? Do you know?
This is one of the really the big secrets here, is that what the Germans had established in Antarctica had become so advanced and so powerful that by the early 1950s they were able to do overflights of U.S. cities. And in particular, 1952, in July, on successive weekends, there were flying saucers over Washington, D.C. And these saucers, they were tracked on radar. Pilots were sent out there to kind of intercept them. You had thousands of kind of civilians watching them. And you had photographs of these craft. And the big thing here, Chris, was that these craft were actually Nazi or German craft, that the German craft from Antarctica had become so powerful that they could overfly Washington, D.C. with impunity. And basically what happened, and this was something that Admiral Richard Byrd warned about in 1947, in January, after the failure of Operation High Jump. He gave an interview in Chile where he spoke to the Chilean newspaper and the world media that were there at the time, and he said that a new enemy existed that could fly from pole to pole almost instantaneously.
Wow.
And when he got to Washington, D.C., he was muzzled. He couldn't elaborate on that. But now you think of, that's what Byrd said in 1947 in January. Now you look at July 1952, you have flying saucers flying over. They actually had a squadron of flying saucers flying over the capital of the United States, and it turns out that these were the German flying saucers that had been secretly developed in Antarctica. So basically what happened was that President Truman at the time began negotiations with the Nazis, with the Germans. And by the time Eisenhower won the election and got into power, agreements were reached. And basically the U.S. decided, the U.S. National Security authorities, the Eisenhower administration, basically it was a negotiated surrender. There's no easy way of describing this. The United States basically quietly surrendered to the Germans in Antarctica, but it was a negotiated surrender. It wasn't an unconditional surrender. So that meant that basically the Eisenhower administration could maintain the fiction that the United States had won the war, that that basically there was a Cold War happening with the Soviet Union, but that in reality the Germans in Antarctica infiltrated the United States national security system, the military-industrial complex, and so many of the German paperclip scientists, that they were pushed into very senior positions throughout the military-industrial complex. So, for example, you had Werner von Braun becoming the chief of the Marshall Flight Center out of Huntsville, Alabama. You had Kurt de Boos, another Nazi SS official, becoming the head of the the Kennedy Space Center out of Cape Canaveral. You had Nazi scientists being pushed into senior positions throughout the military-industrial complex. So this was, Operation Paperclip was the kind of the way in which the U.S. authorities could justify why so many of these Nazis were being pushed to the front of the crew. A lot of these people didn't even have security clearances, but these Nazis were brought over from Germany throughout the 40s, 50s, and even through the 60s under Operation Paperclip. They were fast-tracked in given security clearances, and we were basically pushed at the front of the the queue in terms of getting senior leadership positions throughout in the U.S. Space program, the NASA space program, the space program that the Air Force was working on. Major U.S. companies were getting these German scientists, and all of this was really part of this negotiated surrender that the Eisenhower administration had reached with the Germans in Antarctica. And all this was done secretly off the books. And so, this is a big reason why the secrecy system has been maintained. It's not just a matter of covering up the existence of these advanced flying saucer technologies. It's also covering up the fact that the Second World War did not end. People were tricked into believing that it ended, that it actually continued, but covertly. And by the early 50s, the United States had to reach terms with the Germans that had established themselves in Antarctica.
Well, why would they do that? Why wouldn't they just completely take over and just enslave, America and other countries? I don't understand why they would do it secretly.
Well, because I think that what happened was that the Germans in Antarctica, these were people that were included a lot of officials from the German secret societies and leading German industrialists. And prior to Second World War, German industrialists and German secret societies worked very, very closely with their peers from the United States. So German industrialists work closely with American industrialists, and German secret societies work closely with U.S. secret societies, as well as with the British and the French secret societies and French industrialists. So that basically the Second World War, even though at a national level you had a war between the United States and its against the Axis powers, but behind the scenes, German industrialists and German secret societies continued to work very closely with their peers from the United States. And there's actually evidence for this. I mean, there's been a lot of work done in terms of exposing how, for example, the Rockefeller family, the Bush family, leading American companies such as IT&T, the Ford Company, that they worked throughout the Second World War with Germany, so that by the end of the war, the secret societies and the industrialists from both Germany and the United States, they just continued to work together, but now it was in Antarctica. And so that meant that by the time the negotiations really took off in 1952, the German industrialists and the American industrialists who had worked together already had a foundation for how collaboration could continue. So there was no need for the war to resume, to become an open war, because that would have been very inefficient in terms of what the Germans wanted to do. They wanted to go deploy deep in space, and they needed American industrial resources, American personnel to kind of help them expand out, because they had their eyes on a much bigger picture, doing an overt conquest of the Earth wasn't going to be the best use of their resources. So that they set their goal on a kind of covert control over the planet, and being able to develop space fleets so that they could establish a presence on Mars, the asteroid belt, the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and even beyond our solar system. This is what the German space program was doing out of Antarctica, and they basically wanted to have U.S. secret societies and U.S. corporations provide the personnel and the resources for this to move forward.
So, I mean, I remember hearing that we after the war, we took some of the scientists, we put them into secret projects, we put them into various projects. There was secret prison camps all over America with Nazis and stuff, and they were used, questioned, who knows what went on. But then also there's other stories that around that time period, aliens started working with our government and going into secret military bases underground, back engineering stuff. We started building a relationship with them. I mean, how does that play into all this?
Well, that's another level here of, another level of complexity to what was going on behind the scenes, because not only did you have the Germans surviving in Antarctica, but they were also working with a group of extraterrestrials. This was a group that are described as kind of reptilian looking, and they were helping the Germans in Antarctica move forward with their space program, because it's like the Germans were working with this kind of reptilian group of extraterrestrials as kind of like a mercenary force, if you like. And so the Navy, the U.S. Navy, learned about this. And so they began working with another group of extraterrestrials who were kind of opposed to the reptilians, and those are the Nordic extraterrestrials. And so from the early 1950s, actually even earlier, from that Los Angeles incident, according to one of the key witnesses that I've been working with, William Tompkins, whose testimony I focus on a lot in that U.S. Navy Secret Space Program book. Basically, the Nordic extraterrestrials began working with the Navy during the Second World War because they were the enemy of the reptilian extraterrestrials who were working with the Axis powers and with Nazi Germany in particular. So you have different extraterrestrial groups working with different kind of World War II belligerents. So it's almost like World War II, in a way, was a proxy war between different extraterrestrial groups, one side working with the Axis powers and the other side working with the Allied powers. So after World War II, you have this kind of continuation of the Nazi regime in Antarctica. They continue to work with one group of extraterrestrials, the reptilians, and in the United States, you actually have the Navy working with the Nordics. But what happened was that in 1952, when you had the overflights and then the agreements that were reached under the Eisenhower administration in 1953, 1954, what happened then was that the U.S. Air Force in particular began working much more closely with the same kind of extraterrestrial groups that were working with the Germans in Antarctica. So the picture now becomes really complex, and because now you have the Air Force working with one faction of extraterrestrials who are allied with this kind of German group in Antarctica, and another group of extraterrestrials working with the Navy, who is building its own space program without the Air Force knowing. So, and here you have like compartmentalization existing to the degree that the U.S. Air Force is building a secret space program in alliance with particular extraterrestrial groups who are also working with the Germans in Antarctica, and the Air Force officials are not aware that the Navy is building its own secret space program, working with another group of extraterrestrials called the Nordics. And so in the United States, we actually have multiple space programs. You have the publicly acknowledged space program run by NASA. Then at a more secretive level, you have another program that is run by the Air Force. A more compartmentalized program exists, which is run by the Navy. and they operate in deep space using battle groups. So I can talk a little bit more about, what the Navy has in space and what the Air Force has in space.
Yeah, the one question I have though is in dealing with the Nordics, I mean, they're a friendly race, right?
Most of the Nordic extraterrestrial races are friendly. Not all of them are. Some of them are working with the reptilians. And similarly, not all the reptilian races are hostile. Some of them are working with have a more kind of positive outlook and work with the kind of Nordics. So it's really, it's quite complex. But generally speaking, yes, the Nordics work with the Navy, and they're the good guys. And generally speaking, the reptilians are kind of like, the bad guys working with the Germans down in Antarctica.
Jeez. So we've got this space program that publicly hasn't done much. We haven't gone to the moon. We haven't done too much. We're spending this money on stuff that pretty much is childish compared to the technology that we really do have.
Correct. Yes, the rocket technologies, the propulsion systems that they use, is very primitive compared to some of these anti-gravity torsion field technologies that are used by the Air Force program and especially the Navy program. The Navy program is far more advanced. I mean, they have a kilometer-long or a mile-long space cruisers and carriers. So they have these huge craft that they have secretly built using their classified facilities in China Lake and also in the Wasatch Mountains of Utah. And they've been able to deploy these huge mile-long motherships into deep space, all secretly through their secret construction facilities in the Wasatch Mountains, where these kind of giant doors open up in the desert down there, and these kind of mile-long craft that have been secretly assembled just kind of fly out at night and then go out into deep space. And, we're kind of kept in the dark about all of this.
Wow. So what do you think is their agenda? I mean, with this space program and the Nordics, what's their agenda?
Well, basically, what's happened is that the United States and the other major nations have been very quickly introduced to a wider galactic community.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, even though publicly, we think we're insulated, and we're like the proverbial fish in the fishbowl. Just because we think we're the only game in town doesn't affect, what's out there that's looking at us. And so basically what's happened is that the major nations and the major military services and the corporations and the kind of industrial elite that run these corporations realize that we are part of a big galactic community where there are the good, the bad, and the indifferent. That's basically the way you can summarize that. There's a lot more good guys out there, but the bad guys out there are kind of pretty mean and nasty and very dangerous, and you need to be careful. And there's a lot out there that are pretty indifferent, that kind of look at us as kind of like the way we look at ants, as, oh, well, isn't it interesting that ants are kind of like display a certain level of social sophistication, where they can actually imprison or capture kind of smaller insects and kind of like use them for their purposes and so forth and so forth. So, we are, for some extraterrestrial species out there, kind of like ants to them. But other species are wanting to help us evolve and are collaborating, and others see us as a resource to be manipulated. So it's there's a big galactic community out there, and according to the estimates that have been given to me, there are approximately 40 to 60 different extraterrestrial civilizations
right.
that have been working with humanity going back 500,000 years.
And so, can I assume that one of the reasons why they've created this alliance is to protect themselves or prepare for some of these negative extraterrestrials or these evil ones? Or
Well, because we actually have been infiltrated, that the
Yeah.
negative ETs have been here a long time, and that they have been working through the secret societies and the kind of industrial elite
Mm-hmm.
um, to create their own programs or to kind of like manipulate official uh, state policies in a way that kind of suits their agenda. You've got those kind of negative groups that have been working through the secret societies, and then you've got the positive extraterrestrial groups that are kind of working more with white hats within the military institutions, or with, say, kind of like institutions such as the FBI, which by and large still has a lot of good people in there wanting to do good things, and as opposed to, say, the CIA, whose clandestine services division is deeply kind of infiltrated by these kind of more negative agendas.
Jeez. So let's backtrack, because I mean, this is, it's mind blowing, because we're obviously, like Abraham Lincoln used to say, knowledge is a very powerful thing. And to keep us as a human race in control, there's the military industrial complex, though, that deals with the war. A lot of money is made off of war, plus it's a way to, keep the population in check in a way. Obviously politics is most likely just being controlled by a higher source. Even all the drama we deal with politics is probably all predetermined, since there's this huge alliance and there's this huge military thing that's going on in space. But how long is this going to continue? I mean, are we ever going to be told this is going on? Is it ever going to be revealed? Is there going to be some great change? I just don't understand why they would keep doing this secretly. There's got to be some end to it.
I think there is going to be an end to it, and we've been kind of seeing that. I mean, there's been a gradual disclosure process where more and more whistleblowers have been allowed to come forward. For example, Bill Tompkins, who I worked with closely in putting together this book, he was actually authorized to come forward by a Navy admiral who said that this information needs to get out into the public arena. And so there are people, especially in the Navy, but also in the other military services. The Marine Corps works closely with the Navy on this. I mean, the Marines are part of the Navy, actually. The Army is also kind of like very eager to get this information out. The Air Force is kind of less motivated to do so. But between the Navy and the Army and the Marine Corps, you've got the kind of the bulk of the U.S. military services, along with kind of like many people within like the FBI, the State Department, and other kind of institutions that have been allowing this information to come forward through authorized leaks. And so now what we are witnessing is, the leaks have become so big and so much is coming out that now, people are hearing this kind of information, so that, their goal is to leak enough of this information so that by the time the Washington Post and the New York Times starts releasing stories on this kind of information that we've been discussing, most of the readers will say, oh, I knew that. Yeah, that was no big deal. I knew about this a year ago and all of that. So that way, people will be acclimated so that official disclosure is not going to be a shock. And people will kind of like almost feel psychologically that they were ahead of the game, because they'll say, oh, I knew about this 2 years ago. And so that's the way in which they've been getting this ready. But I think that there is a real possibility with this new administration, with Trump, who really is someone who is a wild card. No one knows what he's going to do. I mean, he could tweet it tomorrow. I mean, that's what can happen. He's unpredictable. He could tweet tomorrow that, oh, I was briefed about a secret Navy space program that has mile-long motherships. Fancy that. There it is.
Well, here's the thing. I've seen UFOs. I've seen probably, it's got to be about 8 or 9 UFOs now. And I've been seeing them more frequently. I mean, I just saw a cigar-shaped craft a few months ago, called up my friend during the day, and he saw it too. We both watched it for 10 minutes. Disappeared, then it reappeared, then it did something strange with the clouds. I mean, it was evident we were seeing a craft because of the way it moved and how big it was. We begin to wonder who's controlling that. There's many different types of craft that I've seen, in various different states where I've been, all the way from Mexico to Florida and Arizona, as well as, of course, in Chicago, Illinois. So you got to wonder, are they Nazis flying it? Are they us? Or are they extraterrestrial? It could be a mix of all of those things.
Exactly. Yes, it really is. Can be a mix of all of those things. Although what I'm told, just a general rule of thumb, is that if you see something that looks like a cigar-shaped vehicle,
yeah,
it's more than likely going to look. It's going to be one of ours, or like a saucer shape. It's going to be one of ours. Whereas the kind of more triangular shape, that could be one of the extraterrestrials. But again, that's just very general because they do make kind of triangular shaped craft as well. The TR-3B, for example, is one of the craft that is made, and it's used extensively by the Air Force.
Now, you've done a lot of research on the FOIA documents. Can you explain that and what you found out?
Sure. Well, there's different types of documents that are out there that talk about various aspects of this. There's FOIA documents that were released, through the Freedom of Information Act that kind of talk about different aspects of all of this. And these are typically, they're made available in the National Archives, or you have to request it from the different service to get that. Then there are leaked documents. And these are documents that are basically things like the Majestic documents, where someone from within the system has leaked something that has not been authorized for disclosure or authorized for release. And so that means that no one kind of owns up to it. None of the military services confirms that this document is legitimate, but yet when you do the scrutiny of those documents, it shows that the documents are real. So there's the leaked documents, which have not been kind of authorized for release, and then there are the FOIA documents that have been authorized for release. So when you put all that together, you can get a fairly good idea of what's been happening behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I feel it's important that we need to really consider both sets of documents, because some people just focus on the FOIA documents and say, well, this is what's kind of like been authorized and has been confirmed to be genuine by one particular branch of the government or the military, and they ignore the leaked Majestic documents. But that's a big mistake, because if you do that, you're only getting to kind of see the surface of what's going on. With the leaked documents, you get to see deeper down, in terms of like the proverbial iceberg, where you get to see more of what's underneath the surface. And then you get the whistleblowers, and the whistleblowers really are really critical for understanding what's going on. The whistleblowers or witnesses like Bill Tompkins, Corey Good, Clark McClelland, there's a whole bunch, Philip Corso, many different whistleblowers who I think are very credible, who are giving us an idea of what's going on. So when you combine all of these different sources of information, I think what we have there is disclosure, open disclosure, a genuine disclosure, and probably something that's always going to be far ahead of anything that is officially disclosed. So that's why it's always important that we kind of like combine what the whistleblowers are telling us, what the leaked documents are telling us, with what the official documents are telling us, and combine all of that. And that way we can get a good idea of, the complexity of the different secret space programs that are out there.
Yeah, Charles Hall has talked about the whites in how they're involved with a certain part of our government. These extraterrestrial beings that are white and they glow, as well as the Prime Minister of Defense, the retired Prime Minister of Defense, has come forward and said he knows of three to four alien races that are actually working with certain parts of our government. And you got to wonder if they're all on the same page, or they all have their different agenda and they're working against each other. Are you familiar with some of the other races that are working covertly with our government?
Yes, I am aware of those different races. Yes, they all have their own agenda, even though they might have, one particular group kind of like at the apex. So, for example, the draconian reptilians are generally viewed to be kind of like at the apex of this kind of negative hierarchy of extraterrestrials. And underneath them, you have like different groups such as the tall greys or the short greys. And then you have Charles Hall's, the tall whites.
Right.
Then there's another group, the insectoids, and then kind of other reptilian looking groups. So there is a kind of a negative hierarchy of extraterrestrials that have their own agendas, but they all coordinate underneath one particular group, the draconian reptilians.
So you think the draconian reptilians are pretty much running everything on our planet?
No, I don't think so. I think they try. I think
Right.
that they are a very powerful group that try to run everything, and that they kind of like have a hand in many different institutions and secret societies and military services and try to influence things. But I think that they're just one faction, a very powerful faction, but just one faction amongst many that are all jockeying for kind of influence on the planet. So, for example, the Draconians, they don't want people to know the truth about the secret space programs, about the different extraterrestrial civilizations visiting us. But despite them trying to kind of like keep the lid on all of this, we see that there's more and more disclosures happening. More of the truth is coming out because they know that you can only manipulate people through secrecy, because when you have things out in the open, when things become transparent, it's very hard to manipulate people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, this is why the Draconians and the groups working with them want the secrecy system to perpetuate itself.
Right.
Whereas, the Nordic extraterrestrials, along with the Navy and others that are part of this kind of more positive agenda, they want openness, they want transparency, they want disclosure, because they realize that this is the best way to bring integrity to the planet. Because if they don't do that, they realize that at the end of the day, eventually our planet will it's either going to go light or dark. There's no, at the moment we're kind of like in this compromise
Mm-hmm.
period. We're in this period where we're kind of like in a grey phase where, we're neither dark or light, but one or the other is going to triumph. And the thing is, those that are working to get the truth out realize that if they don't succeed in disclosure, in bringing all of this out, what's going to happen is that the secrecy system is going to become so pervasive that the dark agenda will win, and for all intents and purposes, that the Earth will be lost to this kind of more positive agenda. But given the strength of the alternative media, shows like yours that are presenting hundreds of thousands or millions of people this information that the mass media isn't talking about, that disclosure is moving forward. And so I feel very confident that this kind of more positive agenda is going to win, and that the truth will be revealed to everyone at some point.
Absolutely. And here's the thing. I mean, this is obviously something that is a great debate, and most people in society, don't believe in, or they question, or they just don't have time to think of it, because we're in this rat race system of media and entertainment that keeps us in this bubble, and we don't really tend to think out of that. We don't have time for it. We don't want to, but we're controlled in a certain way to pay attention to other things that tend to distract us from what's going on in the universe. And I've seen UFOs. I've seen other things that have blown my mind that, I just don't want to talk about publicly because I'm still trying to figure it out. But I'm well aware, and I firmly believe, that aliens exist, that UFOs exist. It's logical. There is so much evidence to support it. There's more evidence to support it than lack of evidence. And to have, like you've even stated, some of these well-respected people to come forward. Philip Corso, I read his book, Day After Roswell, as well as many other government officials, that it gets to a point where they've lived their life, they're tired of the secrecy, they realize they don't have much time, and they don't want to have any regrets. They get it off their shoulders. There's no other reason for them to come forward, because they realize that they want to contribute something, and they feel that we shouldn't be in the dark anymore. The question is that many times we just don't know what to believe, because, you know, those people that are coming forward, there's also ones that are being pushed forward to mislead us. And it gets, you know, we get into this tangled web. What a tangled web we weave. And I hope within my lifetime we find out the truth. I hope it's a pleasant one. I hope it doesn't create a war, and it's something that we can advance very quickly together. But I just don't know what to expect, especially with what's going on in politics today.
Right, exactly. It's very unpredictable, but I feel as though there is a real chance here that you know, someone like Trump can really be a positive force for good if he discloses what's going on. That if he decides that he's had enough of, you know, the kind of the political agendas that are kind of undermining him, the secret societies, the deep state that are kind of doing this, that he's going to kind of spill the beans on what's really going on, then life on the planet is going to change very, very rapidly. I know, for example, that one of the first things he did was to request for a lot of the secret patents that have been withheld from public release to be released. That he authorized. There's currently around 6,500 patents that are held up under secrecy orders, and he's ordered for 1,000 of these to be declassified.
Wow.
And these deal with alternative energy, free kind of alternative health, and kind of material sciences. And so, if just those 1,000 technologies are released, that itself will revolutionize the planet.
Well, it'd be nice to know, and I think it would pretty much rock people's world. How I can't even imagine how things would be different. But I want to thank you very much, Dr. Michael Salla, for coming on and sharing this with us. I think a lot of my listeners can be more than they can handle. So what I would suggest to them is that they pick up Dr. Salla's book called The U.S. Navy's Secret Space Program and Nordic Extraterrestrial Alliance. You can go to his website, www.exopolitics.org. That's exopolitics.org. I will have this link up on my site right below the podcast, as well as Michael's Amazon page that you can also click on, and you can check out the vast amount of books that he has covering some very interesting topics, as well as his website. You can go and see some of the articles he has that are very interesting, such as, is Pentagon using MOAB bombs against giants hid in Afghanistan? I remember hearing on the radio some people have come forward stating that some giants have been discovered in some of the mountains when we were looking for Al-Qaeda. And do some of the giants still exist? So that'd be an interesting article to read as well. Doctor, any final words before we sign off?
Well, I want to thank you, Chris, for having me on the show, and just that your audience is really going to be a critical player in all of this, because everyone listening to this has a friend, has a relative who's maybe skeptical about this kind of information. But when you share this with them, then you're actually helping tip the scales in favor of disclosure. So I want to thank you and everyone listening for being open to this information. So aloha.
Well, thank you very much, Doctor. This is Chris Fleming and Dr. Michael Salla. You've been listening to this month's edition of Spirit Talk. I'll see you next month.